So today we're going to talk about, I don't know who Corey Pop is, but apparently this was a solid video on Marcellus Williams. We can use this as an anchor to cover the story. Let's take a look.
Right now, you're looking at an innocent man currently awaiting execution. 7 years ago, the DNA on the murder weapon was finally tested and proved it was not his.
Whoever handled this knife left DNA. It is not Marcellus Williams.
His execution was stayed by the then governor, and a panel was convened to reassess his conviction.
Today, a panel will work to decide if that evidence proves Williams is innocent.
So, why is he still here?
How innocent do you have to be to avoid being executed?
This is an injustice, it's wrong. The evidence shows my dad is innocent.
The closer you get to execution, the stranger things get.
How can this happen with so much evidence? What do you mean? This is America. All of the violence that we contribute to globally, we also do to ourselves on a regular basis. He's a black man in Missouri. That's it. The reason why I obviously wanted to talk about this is because you have another real life example of an innocent black man who is going to be executed when virtually everyone understands that he is not guilty of the crime that he is about to be executed for. It is an unfortunate, unimaginable cruelty that happens quite frequently in this country. It's one of the major reasons why I routinely talk against capital punishment, against the death penalty, and yet here we are in the United States of America doing it all over again.
On August 11th, 1998, Felicia Gale, a 42-year-old former reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was brutally murdered in her home in St. Louis, Missouri. She had been stabbed over 40 times. It mimicked
the knife lodged in her neck in a burglary.
A murder that had happened just 24 days before. Another woman, Deborah McLean, was murdered in her kitchen with a knife taken from the home, an eerily similar scene to Felicia Gale's murder. The investigation languished for months. Despite the similarities between,
they claimed that it was a burglary. That part is important because it ties it back to Marcellus Williams.
The two murders, the knives being left at both scenes, there being bloody footprints in Gale's house. The police had little to go on. No eyewitnesses, no leads for either. Then, a year later, there was a break in the Gale case. It came in the form of a man named Henry Cole, a jailhouse informant who had said his cellmate had confessed to the murder. That eventually led to the arrest of Marcellus Williams, who was charged with Gale's murder. McLean's murder remains unsolved to this day, but Marcellus was in lockup, so he couldn't have done it. The case against Williams for Gale's murder was largely circumstantial.
This was a very brutal murder of a woman who was found in her home, having been stabbed to death. There were bloody footprints at the crime scene, fingerprints, hairs found in the victim's hand, none of which matched Marcellus. Those were not his bloody footprints, those were not his hairs, and the fingerprints were destroyed.
The state's prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of two informants who had been incentivized to testify.
The only evidence they used to convict him is what we call incentivized informant testimonies. Individuals who came forward because they had something to gain.
The first was Cole.
So Marcellus had been in the workhouse, and someone who was incarcerated with him hears there's reward money and essentially says, I want this reward money and I want help with my own case, and says he won't even testify until he gets that reward money.
The second was Williams' former girlfriend, Laura Sorrow.
In addition, there's another individual, a woman who Marcellus was known to affiliate with. Notably, the two of them contradict each other in what they say would have happened and contradict physical evidence that's found at the crime scene.
The key piece of evidence brought against him was Gale's laptop, which he was said to have sold.
The last piece of evidence that they use is a laptop that had been taken from the victim's house that Marcellus did sell. But what wasn't presented at trial was that the woman that had come forward and said she had information and manufactured these statements about Marcellus is the person who gave him that laptop. And so it wasn't allowed to come out that really the only connection to the crime is this informant and not Marcellus Williams.
There were even eyewitnesses who had said they had seen Asaro with the laptop while Marcellus was still in county.
Usually in death penalty cases, the evidence of guilt is overwhelming, and the only real issue you can litigate in most cases is whether the death penalty was appropriately given. This case was different in that the evidence that they used to convict him was pretty thin and questionable.
All of this should have been easy to poke holes in for most attorneys, but these problems continued at trial. Since his conviction, Williams has argued in several motions that he received ineffective counsel during the trial, which came from a public defender assigned to him. It's no secret that America's public defender system has been stretched to its breaking point, but nowhere near as much as Missouri, which ranks 49th in the country in spending on indigent defenses. In 2017 alone, 320 public defenders handled 80,000 cases in the state of Missouri. The state has repeatedly vetoed bills that would supply funding to help alleviate this caseload.
The Missouri State Public Defender System is asking...
Yeah, this case is particularly unique because the prosecutor that convicted Williams is a prominent figure pushing for his sentence to be vacated. This never happens unless an error is particularly egregious on behalf of the prosecutor. Another similar case is in Texas with the person on death row being a white man, where it's not the prosecutor necessarily, but the main detective, the lead investigator, that is also pushing to vacate his sentence as well. Yes, this is literally every single person involved in this court case is now aware of Marcellus Williams' innocence. Every single person, okay? It is insane that this is even a point of contention, and the only person who could stop this from happening right now is the governor. The victim's family is obviously defending the innocence of Marcellus Williams. I believe jurors themselves have come out and been like, we made the wrong decision given the information that we had at the time. He is innocent. The only person who can pardon Marcellus Williams and stop him from being executed by the state is the governor of Missouri. The problem, however, is that the governor of Missouri yesterday came out and said he will not stop this execution. No, Biden cannot stop this execution. He could call the governor and tell him to stop this execution. He could use the bully pulpit, but he cannot directly, legally stop this execution. This is a state-level crime. In the United States of America, the president can pardon crimes only at the federal level. The only person who can stop this is the current governor of Missouri.
At jury selection, Marcellus ended up with a mostly white jury when the prosecution struck 6 of the 7 qualified black jurors. When the trial was over, despite the questionable witnesses and the evidence being all circumstantial, they deliberated for less than 90 minutes before finding him guilty. There's something in the U.S. judicial system called a Batson challenge that is supposed to prevent the prosecution from striking qualified jurors on the sole ground of group bias. In this case, race. This was a black man being tried by an almost entirely white jury for a white woman's death in Missouri in the 1990s. When Marcellus' defense tried to argue Batson in a 2003 motion, the state indicated that the jurors were struck because the prosecution stated their clothing indicated they were trying to be different. But that was reason enough and not racially motivated, so Batson didn't apply. For years, Marcellus pleaded his innocence. His case was taken up by multiple different legal teams who fought tooth and nail to finally get the DNA that they had found on the knife properly tested. It turned out to be another man's profile.
There is a DNA testing statute in the Missouri law, but it's real narrowly written, so we just had to make that request in a broader claim of that he was innocent, or there's enough doubts about his innocence that he shouldn't be executed, and we can prove it if you let us do this further DNA testing.
It's not always a weapon like in Marcellus's case where it's left in the victim's body. That's a incredibly obvious piece of evidence. To know that wasn't tested was just shocking. It just blew my mind. Don't you think you
Wouldn't this ruin the governor's reputation in future election along with the resulting in his local protesting against him? What are you talking about? Nobody gives a shit. It's another innocent black man being executed. It happens all the time in the United States of America, and the U.S. Supreme Court genuinely loves continuing with these executions on a regular basis. No, it happens all the time. According to Slate, we are currently witnessing the worst execution spree in 3 decades. Okay, this was written on September 23rd, 2024, yesterday. This week is shaping up to be a very bad one for death penalty opponents in the United States. If all goes according to plan, states will put 5 people to death in a 1-week span ending Thursday. That is an unusual, though not unprecedented, number of executions in such a short period of time. To understand just how unusual it is, consider that in 2023, the total number of executions for the entire year was 24, less than 1 execution every other week. In 2022, 18 people were put to death for a rate of roughly 1 execution every 3rd week. Indeed, one would have to go back almost 3 decades to 1997 to find a parallel to what may unfold this week. During a 7-day period in May that year, Texas executed 5 people. South Carolina executed Khalil, Allah, formerly known as Freddie Owens, in his first executions in 2011. The others are planned for Tuesday and Thursday in Texas, Missouri, Alabama, and Oklahoma, all of which regularly carry out executions. It is just a coincidence that all these states are moving in lockstep. Coincidence or not, or a close look at each of the cases in which some will be executed this week highlights not just the kind of horrible crimes that can lead someone on death row, but also many of the penalty's crippling problems. This week's executions include 2 cases in which there are substantial doubts about whether that person being executed is actually innocent. 2 others illustrate the fact that the death penalty is often used against people who are poor, vulnerable, abused, in many ways broken, not against the worst criminals. The 5th highlights America's futile search for a method of execution that will be safe, reliable, and humane, which is, of course, ironic to say. Ridiculous. An oxymoronic statement. Looking for a method of execution that is safe, reliable, and humane. Every aspect of the capital punishment, from the methods used to how you are going to deploy this execution in a consistent manner, is completely broken. It's a fundamentally contradictory argument. The fact that 3 of the 5 people who will be executed this week are black only underlines the continuing salience of race in determining who gets sentenced to death and executed. All told, this week's execution spree should unsettle all Americans, whether or not they support the death penalty. It will offer further reasons for why capital punishment should be abolished everywhere in this country. To see why, let's start with last Friday's execution of Khalil Allah. He was convicted of the 1997 murder of Irene Granger Graves, a single mother of 3 who worked as a convenience store clerk. No physical evidence connected Allah to the crime. The key evidence against him was testimony from his co-defendant, Stephen Golden, who said Allah shot Graves. Golden did so after reaching a deal with the prosecutors that he would not be given a death sentence in return for his testimony. Allah maintained his innocence from the time he was arrested to the day he died. And just before South Carolina put him to death, new evidence came to light suggesting what he had been saying for years was true. Last Wednesday, Golden recanted his testimony and signed an affidavit saying, Freddie Owens is not the person who shot Irene Graves at the Speedway on November 1st, 1997. Freddie was not present when I robbed the Speedway that day. But neither the South Carolina Supreme Court, the state's governor, nor the United States Supreme Court moved in a way that would save Allah from the ultimate punishment for a crime he may not have even committed. On Tuesday, which is today, Missouri is going to follow through on the execution of Marcellus Williams, the reason why we're talking about this to begin with, who is another victim of a miscarriage of justice. He would be the 3rd death row inmate executed in the state this year. As Newsweek votes, Williams was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in connection with the 1999 death of social worker and former journalist Felicia Gale. None of the physical evidence collected at the scene pointed to Williams. There's also, as we said, recent DNA evidence that shows that his DNA was not on. Like, the DNA matched with the knife on the scene of the crime lodged in the neck of the victim did not have his DNA. As Newsweek notes, Williams was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in connection with the 1998 death of social worker and former journalist Felicia Gale, even though there was no physical evidence that connected him to the scene of the crime. Remember, a knife attack is a deeply personal form of obvious, insane, violent crime. Okay? But due to the personal nature of the crime itself, it is virtually impossible to not leave any DNA at the scene of the crime. Impossible. So while forensic evidence oftentimes can get things wrong, this is one of those instances where if he was at the scene of the crime, he would have left some kind of evidence. Williams' connection, like Allah's Newsweek suggests, turned on the testimony of 2 unreliable witnesses who were incentivized by the promises of leniency in their own pending criminal cases and reward money. Eventually, even the prosecutor's office that originally brought the case against Williams asked the courts to stop the execution today. That is going to happen. The prosecutor's office, that right there is insane. Like, that is not a thing that ever happens unless it is so obvious that they fucked up. A lot of people mistake justice for vengeance. Justice is not vengeance. The goal of the justice system is to ensure that these crimes do not happen again. Killing someone is not justice. It's simply vengeance. That's it. And it completely goes against the principle behind the criminal justice system. I have always been an opponent of the death penalty, of capital punishment. I find it to be truly unconscionable. I think it's like yet another glaringly obvious example of the hypocrisy demonstrated by people who claim to be pro-life. It is completely unacceptable. It is barbaric. And the fact that it still exists in the United States of America, which is a standalone country, by the way, in comparison to other OECD nations, is ridiculous. But we are a truly barbaric nation, okay? We are an incredibly draconian nation. Our attitude towards punishing crimes is insanely out of whack. The goal of the criminal justice system is supposed to rehabilitate people who have done horrifying things, okay? No matter how wrong those crimes may be, you should not stray away from your overarching goal of rehabilitating every single person. Now, there are certain instances where at least modern medicine is incapable of truly rehabilitating certain people that have conducted certain crimes. But that should not stop us from trying to find adequate solutions to these problems. It does not mean that someone who has like killed a baby after raping them gets to walk away free. Okay, that is not the argument here. That is not the argument at all. But the argument should be that every single person, because the overwhelming majority of people that are currently in prison are not there for raping and killing a baby. Okay, if you're anti-murder, you absolutely should be anti-murdering people in the hands of the state. Why can't we just put down the criminal subhuman scum? Well, here is the reason why we shouldn't do that. Because 55% of black people comprise 55% of all people that are unjustifiably put forward as perpetrators of murder. Don't you consider that to be a significant wrong? A lot of people get falsely claimed of crimes that they did not commit. What are we talking about? Since 1973, at least 200 people have been executed in the U.S. who were later exonerated, most of which could have been exonerated before their deaths, and some of them were and were still executed. And those are only the instances that we know of with conclusive evidence of their innocence. Yeah, the only other group that could potentially halt the execution is the U.S. Supreme Court, which it, of course, as of literally 5 minutes ago, declined to halt the execution of Missouri death row inmate Marcellus Williams, knowing full well of his innocence. A lot of people will be like, oh, I don't understand. Like, what's the purpose here? Like, what's the reason? It's because they're bad people. They're evil people, and they like doing evil shit. That's it. There's literally no other justification for this. It's because they are evil people. The Supreme Court loves it. They love defending the execution of black men. There is no other way to point to this reality. Literally, if you know anything about the United States Supreme Court, you know this. They do this all the time. They love that shit. Yeah, Antonin Scalia, they say it out loud. Mere factual innocence is no reason not to carry out a death sentence properly reached. I repeat, mere factual innocence is no reason not to carry out a death sentence properly reached. A miscarriage of justice is not a miscarriage of justice at all as long as the death sentence was properly reached. It does not matter. We will execute innocent people as long as the court proceedings were properly conducted. I mean, if you think that that is the worst thing that Antonin Scalia has said, that's Antonin Scalia, who has justified the use of torture in the United States Supreme Court by pointing to 24, a fictional work, by claiming that if there was a terrorist that wanted to nuke DC, like in the television show 24, and torture was the only method to get the information out of him, of course you'd be pro-torture. Or Antonin Scalia, who also once famously made the slippery slope argument about gay people getting married. If gay people can get married, then what's next? What if they want to marry dogs? That is literally... Both of those things are things that Antonin Scalia said and did and defended, positions that he said and publicly defended in dissent. And you can learn about this in an introductory constitutional law class, as I did when I was in college.
A rising star in the GOP has just resigned this afternoon amid an impeachment effort sparked by a pair of scandals.
Today, I am announcing that I will resign as governor of Missouri, effective Friday, June 1st at 5 p.m.
When former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens issued that stay, he impaneled a special board to examine the facts of the case and make a recommendation. But then a personal scandal forced Greitens out, leaving the board in jeopardy and the future of Marcellus Williams entirely unclear.
The governor who succeeded Greitens, Mike Parson, came in as someone tough on crime, which caused many to believe the board was in jeopardy.
I remember CBS coming into town saying, what's going to happen with Marcellus Williams? Will you keep the Board of Inquiry still intact? And he said, I'm going to let them do what Greitens set them up to do.
Now, if you think Governor Parson is a man who doesn't utilize the pardon power, well, you'd be wrong. He has utilized the pardon power. The governor of Missouri, Governor Mike Parson, I almost called him Mike Pardon. It's just, he doesn't like to use it against certain people. Here is Missouri governor pardoning the St. Louis couple who aimed guns at protesters during the Black Lives Matter protests. If you recall, Mark and Patricia McCloskey, who gained prominence for confronting demonstrators had each pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge. They were pardoned. The Missouri governor shortens the DWI prison sentence of former Chiefs assistant coach Britt Reed. Missouri Governor Mike Parson on Friday shortened the prison sentence of former Kansas City Chiefs assistant coach Britt Reed for a drunken driving crash that seriously injured a 5-year-old girl. Yeah, you don't have to make this shit up. They give you plenty of evidence.
After everything Marcellus had been through, for his case to once again be thrown into turmoil for things outside of his control seemed unbelievable. How did the scandal-plagued governor of Missouri's resignation essentially ruin Marcellus's chances at freedom? The funny thing about Parson's tough on crime stance and these actions are that they only seem to apply to certain people in certain cases, further confounding how justice works within the state of Missouri. Parson has been granting pardons and clemency at an exceptional rate, more than any governor of Missouri since the 1940s. But this has a specific political tint to it. Parson
It's just odd. Oh, he covers this. Never mind. Okay. It's just odd because he has given out a lot more pardons than most other governors. So why is it that in this circumstance, when there's a dude who is straight up innocent, he is refusing to pardon him?
Since clemency only comes for people like Mark and Patricia McCloskey, the couple who became famous for waving guns at Black Lives Matter protesters.
Missouri Governor Mike Parson's office confirms his recent group of pardons and commutations include Mark and Patricia McCloskey. The St. Louis couple made national headlines last summer when they waved guns at demonstrators in their Central West End neighborhood.
As of August 2022, 90% of Parson's pardons have been white petitioners, which when you look at the demographics of those incarcerated in the state seems nearly impossible. For those outside of Parson's purview, the justice system seems...
Let's just hold on. I need you to understand one more time this fact. As of August 2022, 90% of the governor of Missouri, Parson's pardons have been white petitioners.
Pardons have the demographics of those in...
When you look at the demographics, white people comprise 55% of the Missouri jail population.
The state seems nearly impossible. For those outside of Parson's purview, the justice system seems to lean its full weight on them. Parson dissolved the board of inquiry looking into Marcellus's case and took no further action.
We filed a civil lawsuit saying we don't believe the governor has the authority to dissolve that board because he had to wait until they finished their work. Once they finished their work, he could do what he wanted with his clemency powers, but the order had already been there. Unfortunately, the Missouri Supreme Court disagreed with that and recently dismissed that civil case. And at that point, the Attorney General argued there was no other reason that an execution date shouldn't be set.
This is the last part of the process. Here it is. Missouri Governor Mike Parson has also said that he is potentially going to either release or shorten the prison sentence of the first Kansas City police officer ever convicted of killing a black man, signaling in recent comments his disapproval of the former detective's incarceration. A Republican in the final months of his time in office came close to a promising commutation or pardon for the KCPD detective Eric DeVal Canary in a radio interview last week. The comments are the furthest the governor, a former Polk County sheriff, has gone in telegraphing that he plans to take action in the case. There's not a week that goes by that somebody is not reaching out to me about that issue, and we're going to see what happens here before long. I'll leave it at that. But you know, I don't like where he's at. I'll just say that. DeVal Canary was found guilty at a trial in Jackson County in 2021 on charges of second-degree involuntary manslaughter and armed criminal action in the killing of 26-year-old Cameron Lamb. DeVal Canary is currently serving a 6-year sentence after shooting Lamb as Lamb was backing up his pickup truck into his garage. DeVal Canary is believed to be in custody in an out-of-state prison after previously being held in state prison in Fulton. The Missouri Supreme Court has declined to overturn his convictions, leaving commutation and pardon by the governor as his only viable option to leave prison.
The Attorney General's office in the state of Missouri has fought tooth and nail against every appeal and every hearing in the last several decades.
When they fight it, they fight to just prevent a hearing from even happening. And that's what we see time and time again, this argument of finality over fairness. We just need to be done, and not that we just need to get it right. When you have an office that takes these really hardline approaches, there's not a lot of room for the facts or justice in those cracks in between.
Combined with the laws the state has enacted over these years, it has caused so many problems for those arguing wrongful convictions.
If you've got evidence that you got an unfair trial, or if you got or wrongfully convicted, it shouldn't matter that there's a procedural problem in the case. The court ought to hear it.
Just a few weeks ago, the AG's office blocked the release of Christopher Dunn, who had served 30 years for a crime he didn't commit.
Our top story, he was just minutes away from walking free. The 11th hour move by the Missouri Supreme Court halting the release of Christopher Dunn.
A circuit court judge overturned his conviction on the basis that both eyewitnesses had recanted their stories. Dunn was set to be released, only to have Missouri's current AG, Andrew Bailey, block it through the Missouri Supreme Court.
On Monday, a St. Louis Circuit Court judge overturned his conviction, but Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey appealed his release. On Wednesday, that same...
Like, you have to understand, like, this is just straight white supremacy, right? If you're asking what the f***'s going on, like, how do we get here? How does this happen? It is just pure, unfiltered, unvarnished white supremacy. That's it. Like, what purpose, what kind of threat does this person constitute to society that he must remain behind bars? Even if he had actually even if he actually did the crime at this point, even if he had actually done the crime after decades spent in prison, like what threat does this person have? The only reason why you are spending government resources on this is because you want to, I mean, it serves the exact same purpose as like putting statues of the Confederate generals right outside of the courthouse, okay? It is a constant reminder and a reaffirmation that this is a white supremacist criminal justice system and you should know your place, okay? That's it. That's it.
The human cost of these systematic failures is staggering. Collectively, Missouri's exonerees have served hundreds of years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. Families have been torn apart, lives derailed, and the true perpetrators were left to commit further crimes. Marcellus's son knows all too well about this pain and the waiting, the keeping hope, the lengthy legal processes.
My dad in this up situation, I'm really got to be there for him. You know what I'm saying? You got to let your dad know you love him. You know, get somebody their roses while they still alive. These people want to put all the pressure. They make the visits uncomfortable. They make the lawyers run around in circles. You know what I'm saying? It's just too much.
Some studies indicate that 4 to 6% of the inmate population in America is actually innocent, which would mean that there could be hundreds more in Missouri behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. For a state that incarcerates its population at a rate higher than the national average and higher than most countries in the world, it needs to be sure it's getting these convictions right. Instead, it spent years railing against policies that would alleviate the...
You get it? Do you understand? America never abolished slavery. They just simply legalized it in the form of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system that's historically been used and will continue to be used against overwhelmingly black and brown population. And yes, white supremacy does end up sometimes directly harming, in many instances, actually, directly harming white people as well. It's the same reason why white people are shocked when police brutalize them and they go, "What are you doing to me? I'm not black." But other white people look at that and go, "Look, sometimes it's going to happen." Because ultimately, that violent force is used against those we have decided need to be violently suppressed. It's kind of, it kind of comes with the territory. Some white people will also have to stay in prison, even if they are innocent, because ultimately we're using that structure to enslave black and brown people.
It's been 7 long years since the lab finally properly tested the DNA on the murder weapon found in Felicia Gale and proved it was not Marcellus Williams. It has been 7 long years since Marcellus Williams' lawyers have been seeking an evidentiary hearing to present this bombshell. And it has been 7 long years of the state of Missouri fighting this revelation like it has every other case. Finally, after the execution date was set, the state decided it would allow an evidentiary hearing for the DNA evidence. Then, the AG, Andrew Bailey, filed a writ of probation to dismiss the hearing. The court rejected this, and the hearing will still proceed on August 21st. But not for lack of trying.
What's so disturbing about what's happening in Marcellus's case is that we have in January a prosecutor filing a motion to overturn his conviction on the basis of his innocence in January, and then just 6 months later, an execution date being set before a hearing on that motion has been held.
It's a very real possibility that because of the speed in which the courts work, that the results of the evidentiary hearing will not be known until after Marcellus Williams is executed on September 24th.
There's no coming back from an execution. And where there's DNA evidence and a prosecutor saying, "I want a hearing on this DNA evidence because I believe this person is innocent," to not have that hearing, to just say it's too late, would really say something about what it means to try to seek justice in our system.
beyond the convincing DNA evidence, the ineffective counsel, the contradicting eyewitnesses, something else has come to light. Notably, while Noah was making his documentary, a private investigator had spoken with Asaro before she had passed and said she had recanted her story, saying Marcellus had nothing to do with the murder.
Somebody was following Laura Asaro before she passed, but apparently she said he didn't do it.
It sounds to me like she said twice he didn't do it.
She died before they could get a sworn affidavit.
They tried to get an affidavit to her, and she passed before she could.
Even in spite of all that, all the other evidence in this case that points to Marcellus Williams' innocence should lead to his exoneration, or at least a new trial, but only time will tell if that happens. The governor of Missouri's AG will fight this case to the bitter end, and even if his conviction is overturned, they could block his release from prison, like they did Christopher Dunn and Sandra Hemme. Of course, on top of all this are the ethics of the death penalty, which are for another time.
Doesn't matter where someone stands on the death penalty here. If we want to have that system, there has to be the possibility for somebody to have their innocence heard before a step is taken that can never be undone.
This entire journey has disillusioned me on the justice system's approach to wrongful convictions, and even more so on Missouri's fight for finality over fairness. But it has also taught me that if a case gets enough attention, it very well could mean life or death for the person at the center.
He a good man, he an honorable man, and he an innocent man. So that's that.
This was this guy did phenomenal work. Corey Pop.